Hi everyone, this is the November 2021 paper 2. This is from the Pearson Edexcel IGCSE Human Biology syllabus. This is paper 2, and you're given 1 hour and 45 minutes to complete this exam paper. So we're just going to walk through the questions. The total mark for this paper is 90, so let's get started with the first question. Okay. Part A, the photograph shows a group of red blood cells. Part 1, describe the function of red blood cells. So the purpose of the red blood cells is to transport oxygen from our lungs to the tissues or the cells in the rest of our body. So we need, the cells in our body require oxygen for respiration, and respiration is a process that produces energy so that the processes in our cells could happen. So let's just write that down. So it is responsible for transporting oxygen, so that's the 1 mark, from the lungs to the cells of our body. So this is a 3-mark question, so 1 mark goes to transporting oxygen, the other mark would be from the lungs, and then the 3rd mark would be to the cells of our body, or the tissues of our body. Let's go on to part 2. Explain how the structure of a red blood cell is adapted to its function. So let me just include a diagram here. So this is a very blurry picture of the red blood cell. So we can see that it is biconcave in shape if we were to cut it in half. So bi means 2, and it has this concave shape here and this concave shape here. So it's biconcave, and that is to increase surface area so that gases can come in and out, specifically oxygen, or most importantly, oxygen. So another thing that red blood cells have is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein that is responsible for binding to oxygen so that it can carry it around the body. Another thing is that your red blood cells actually don't have a nucleus. And the reason why that's important is you want to make sure there's enough space for these hemoglobin proteins to be inside the cell. So I'm just going to remove this first and go over the 3 points that I mentioned and then cover some of the rest of the points. So earlier we mentioned that it has a biconcave shape to increase surface area for diffusion. So we also spoke about hemoglobin, right? So it has hemoglobin, so it can, so that maybe oxygen, so that oxygen can bind, what's wrong with my pen? Bind to it. And then we also mentioned that there is no nucleus. The red cell does not contain nucleus. Which allows for more space for hemoglobin. So those are 3 marks so far. Let's just go over them. I know it's 4 marks, but let's go over them first. So 1 is biconcave shape to increase surface area. Another mark is hemoglobin, so that oxygen can bind to it or can transport it. And then does not contain a nucleus, so that you have more space for hemoglobin. So that's actually 3 marks there. Another thing you can also say is that the cell itself, the red blood cells themselves, are very flexible and it allows for them to go through the capillaries. That's one thing you can also say. Another thing you can also say is that the membrane of the red blood cells are very thin, and that allows for a shorter diffusion distance so that oxygen can easily diffuse through. So those are the 2 points we could also say. Let's talk about that here. Okay, so the cells are also flexible, which allow to pass through the capillaries. And then lastly, the membrane of the cell is thin, which reduces the diffusion distance. Whoops, okay, I think my laptop's a little lagging here. Okay, so the cells are flexible, so it allows for it to pass the capillaries. That's the 4th mark, and another mark would be the membrane is thin, so that reduces the diffusion distance. That's 5 marks. Okay, let's go on to part B. The photograph shows a section through a blood vessel in a leg. Part 1, it says, state the type of blood vessel shown in the photograph. So here, this is actually a vein. And the reason why is you can kind of see the valves here. Sorry, let me just circle that properly. So these are the valves, and the valves prevent backflow of blood. Right, so this would actually be a... Whoa. Vein. Okay. Part 2, explain the choice of blood vessel. We mentioned that there are valves present. Are valves present? That's 1 mark. And then you would say which are only found in veins. Okay. Let's move on to part 2. Calculate the actual distance between points A and B. So for this, you actually need to use your ruler to measure the distance between A and B. So A and B is here. Now, if you were to measure it with a ruler, you would get 13 to 15 millimeters. So I'm just going to write 13 here. So 13 millimeters. So imagine you got that. Over here, they've included the magnification. So the equation for magnification and image distance and actual distance would be magnification equals image size over actual size. So let's rearrange the equation so that the actual distance is on one side. So then that would be image size over magnification. So earlier we said it was 13 millimeters, right? Divided by the magnification was 10. So that gives you 1.3 millimeters. All right, those are the 2 marks. Let's move on to question 2. A student uses these 3 tests to identify the contents of 4 powders, W, X, Y, and Z. So they use iodine test, Benedict's test, Biot test. Let's go over them together. So iodine test tests for starch. The original color is orange. And then in the presence of starch, it would turn blue-black. So that's for the iodine test. For Benedict's test, that tests for sugars such as glucose, reducing sugars, I should say. So, reducing sugars. So the original color is blue, and it'll turn red if there is a lot of reducing sugar. If it turns green, orange, yellow, or anything between the colors blue and red, then that means you have a moderate level or a little bit of that reducing sugar. But if it's red, that means you have a lot of that reducing sugar. Burette tests for proteins. The original color is blue as well, and then it'll turn lilac or purple in the presence of protein. Okay, so part A, describe how the student should safely carry out Benedict's test on the powders. So let me see if I can find a diagram. So here's the diagram of the experimental setup. So before we add the Benedict solution into the test tube, because it's in powder form, you actually want to dissolve the powder in water first. So imagine you have a test tube and you fill it in with water, and then you add the powder into that water first, then add Benedict solution, as you can see here, and then put it in a hot water bath and observe any color change that would happen in, let's say, 5 minutes. And because you want to carry out this procedure safely, you want to use safety goggles for this experiment. Okay, let's remove the annotations and this diagram here. All right, so you'd say first, dissolve the powder in water, then add it to the test tube, then add Benedict solution into the test tube. Okay, then put the test tube or heat up the test tube using a hot water bath. Observe any color. Let me spell that properly. To do this experiment safely, wear safety goggles. Okay, let's go over the marks. 1 mark for adding the powder to water. In this case, I've dissolved the powder in water. Mark number 2 is add Benedict's solution. And then 3 is heat the tube with a water bath. So mark number 4 is observe any color changes. Number 5 would be wear safety goggles. Okay, so those are the 5 points. Let's move on to B1. It says identify which powder gives a positive result for starch. So that'll be blue, black. Ooh, black, but a negative result for the other 2. Okay, let's go back up here. Okay, so according to this table, the only one that has starch is powder X and powder Y, because they're both blue, black, or in this case, they've written black here. But which one is negative for both? So remember the original color for Benedict's and for Burette is blue. So here we have blue and blue. So the answer is powder Y. Identify which powders contain proteins but no starch. Okay, so to test for proteins, you would need to use a Burette test, and the only one that does have proteins would be the powder Z and powder W. Now it also says which one does not contain starch. And here, remember for iodine, if you don't have any starch, it'll be orange. Sometimes you'll also see it as yellow/brown. In this case, this is what we see here for both of them. So it's powder W and powder Z. So, whoops. So powder W and Z. Okay. Part 3, identify which powder contains reducing sugar but no protein. So let's scroll back up. Sugars, let me just remove the annotations here. So sugars but no protein, so the only one with sugars are these two. No protein, this will be blue, so this would be powder X. So powder X. And then lastly, part 4, give the contents in powder W. Let's just remove this. So powder W. So this has no starch, no reducing sugar, but it does have proteins. So let's write that down. It has protein. Okay, question 2 is done. Let's move on to question 3. Read the passage below, use the information in the passage and your own knowledge to answer the questions that follow. So for this part, I'm not going to read the passage out loud, so you can read it yourself, and we'll just go on to part A. So which part of the brain controls sweating? That would be the hypothalamus, but let's go over the different parts of the brain. I've included a diagram here. Okay. Let's start off with the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, which is this part here, the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating our movement. So things like running, riding a bicycle, walking, swimming, that kind of stuff, our cerebellum would be responsible for doing that. All right, so the next part is the cerebral hemispheres. So your cerebrum consists of 2 hemispheres, and this is the cerebrum here. So this is giant portion, it's the largest part of the brain, and it's responsible for processing our thoughts. So there are 3 general main functions for your cerebellum. Number 1, it processes the sensory information that we receive. So for example, it processes the things that we see. It processes the things that we taste and touch, for example. Secondly, it's also responsible for helping coordinate our movement. And then lastly, it's responsible for other cognitive functions like memory, reasoning, emotions, and it's responsible for our personality as well. Okay, now the hypothalamus is the part of our brain that's found here. So you can see the hypothalamus there. The hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis. And lastly, we have the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is right here. So you can see that little small part of that brain, and it's responsible for secreting hormones. So hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland are things like ADH, so antidiuretic hormone, which targets the kidneys. You also have things like FSH and LH, so that's responsible for the menstrual cycle. Okay, I'm just going to remove this diagram. Okay, so part B, which type of nerve sends signals to these sweat glands? So this would be the motor neuron. So the motor neuron is responsible for sending electrical impulses to the effector. So the effector could be things like the muscle or the gland. Okay, muscle and glands. Okay, part C, we have describe how sweating controls body temperature. So what happens is that sweat gets released to the surface of our skin, and our body heat is used to cause the water to turn into like water vapor. So essentially it'll evaporate. And when it evaporates, that basically takes the heat away from our body and that cools down our body temperature. So let's write that down. So sweating cools down the body because the heat from the body is used to evaporate the sweat on the surface of the skin. All right, let's go over the marks. You get 1 mark for cools down the body, another mark for the heat is used, and the 3rd mark is to evaporate the sweat from the surface of our skin. Okay, let's move on to part D. Explain the evidence in the passage that indicates primary focal hyperhidrosis is a genetic condition. Okay, let's scroll back up here. All right, so we can see in this last paragraph, they talk about hyperhidrosis, and they mention that there is no known cause. Let me just get the highlighter instead. Okay, there's no known cause, but usually begins in childhood. So that means they are probably born with it, and often runs in the families. So if we go back to, because it says that it often runs in families, that probably indicates that it is a genetic condition, which means that the parents pass on the alleles to their offspring. Okay, so let's write that down. This, or in the passage, it says that this condition runs in the family. Runs in the family. This would mean that the parents pass on their faulty allele to their children, or to their offspring. All right, let's go over the marks. 1 mark for saying runs in the family. So it says to give evidence of the passage. Or evidence in the passage, and that's what we'll put in. And so another mark is faulty allele, and then passes on to their offspring or to their children. Okay, let's go to part E. Secondary hyperhidrosis can be caused by diabetes. Give 1 risk factor for diabetes. So risk factors include a diet of high sugar, and you can say obesity as well, or high BMI. So let me just write one of these points. A diet consisting of high levels of sugar. Okay, let's move on to part F. The passage states that how much we sweat varies from individual to individual and from day to day. Explain why this is the case in people without hyperhidrosis. So the reason why we sweat is to cool down our body, and the reason why our body temperature increases in the first place is one of the reasons is because of the exercise that we're doing, or the amount of activity that we're doing. So for example, if we exercise more, our muscles need to contract more, so it needs more energy, and therefore we have a greater rate of aerobic respiration. And when our rate of aerobic respiration increases, heat just so happens to be a byproduct of that. So that's one of the reasons why when we feel cold, our body shivers. And shivering is just muscle contraction that is occurring. And again, that produces heat and that warms our body. So let's write this down. So the level of exercise can vary from person to person. And also throughout the day. When exercise practicing more the rate of aerobic respiration increases, which warms up our body. Another reason why we sweat is because the environment around us is hotter. So if it's hotter, we sweat more to cool down our body. So let's write that down. So we can say another reason why sweat varies is because of changes to the temperature of the environment. So let me just scroll down. So when the environment is hotter, we would sweat more. Okay, let's go over the marks here. So one of the marks is exercise can vary from person to person. Another one is greater rate of aerobic respiration, which then warms up our body, or increase in body temperature. So the other two marks that are in here is, let me see, the changes in temperature. So changes in temperature of the environment. So, or in the marking scheme, it says external temperature varies, and when it's hotter, we would sweat more. So that is a fifth mark. Other marks that are not in the answer here that's on the marking scheme is mass of individual varies. So what it means by that is the greater the mass of the individual, the more sweat gets produced because they tend to generate a lot more body heat. Another one is the greater the fluid intake, the greater the sweating as well. Okay, let's move on to question 4. The table shows the results of a survey about the number of teeth per student in a class of young students. Okay, draw a bar chart to show the results of the graph. So number of teeth would be the x-axis and the number of student would be the y-axis. So let's write number of teeth here. So we've got 23 up until 28. So we can have 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28. All right, and then the y-axis would be number of students. So number of students. So the first, so it goes up until 13. Let me see if we can fit that here. We can go up in twos, so we can have 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Ooh. Let's just write that down properly. 8, 10, 12, 14. Okay, so the first one is 1 student. So that'll be okay. The other one is 2 students. So that'll be here. Okay, so I've just zoomed it. So hopefully it'll be easier for me to draw out. Okay, so 25 is 3, so that'll be halfway here. Okay, 26 is 4. Sorry, they're not exactly on the line, but make sure you do yours on the line. All right, 27 is 7, so that is between 6 and 8. And the last one is 13, so that's all the way up there. And let me try and zoom out to do the last one. Okay, so make sure you do it on the line. All right, so that is it. Part 2, a full set of teeth for the students is 28. Calculate the percentage of students in the class who have a full set of teeth. So if we scroll back up, the number of people that have a full set of teeth are 13, but how many students are there in the entire class? So let's add up all of these numbers together. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 7 plus 13, that gives you 30 students. So we do 13 divided by 30, 13 divided by 30 times 100 to get the percentage. And that would be 43.3%. Okay. Part B, a full set of teeth for an adult is 32. Suggest why a full set of teeth for these students is only 28. So I'm just going to include a diagram to show you what the set of teeth look like. So when you're a child, what happens is because your mouth is so small, you only have 28 teeth for your full set. But as your mouth gets larger when you're older, these molars are finally able to come out. So we can write that down. So that's why with an adult, you have 32 teeth. Okay. These young students do not have their molars come out because their jaws are too small. Okay, let's go on to part C1. Explain how reducing the amount of sugar in foods help prevent tooth decay. So I'm going to include a diagram here just to show you. Right, so the details that you see at the bottom, you can just kind of ignore that. But basically what happens is that if you have sugar that's in your mouth and it gets and it coats your teeth, what happens is that the bacteria in your mouth would then feed off of these sugars. And when they do, they convert the sugar to acid, specifically lactic acid. And then because it's acidic, it will cause the enamel, which is this white part here of the tooth, to erode. And you can see here, as it starts to erode, the cavity gets deeper and deeper, and eventually it'll start to hurt because you hit the nerves. So you can say reducing the amount of sugar in would reduce of sugar that coats the teeth, therefore the mouth is less likely to convert that sugar to lactic acid. This would mean that the enamel will erode less. Okay, let's go through the marks. So the mark says, okay, so sugar coats the teeth. That's one mark. Another one is bacteria will use that sugar, which is sort of implied here. Convert the sugar to lactic acid. That's a third mark. And then the enamel will erode, or the enamel will erode less if you have less sugar in foods. Okay. The next part 2, state 2 other methods that could reduce food decay. One of them is brushing regularly. Brushing teeth regularly. Another thing that you can also say is make sure you visit the dentist regularly as well. So you're supposed to visit the dentist twice a year. So let's write that down. So make sure to visit the dentist regularly. They can clean it and also check for cavities in your mouth as well. So a third thing that you can also say is making sure you add fluoride to tap water. So that's on the marking scheme. So why fluoride? And that's because fluoride helps strengthen the enamel so that it's less likely to erode. Okay, so question 4 is done. We'll move on to question 5 in the next video then. If you guys have any questions, just put them in the comment section. All right, bye.